Well, hello. Welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs. My name's Alistair Roth. I'm Executive Director of AIIA in Victoria. So welcome to members of AIIA, wherever you may be, whether live here in Dyson House or on Zoom, to our other guests and members of the diplomatic corps joining us, and many members of the Ukrainian or Russian diasporas who may be taking part. The planners will do a panel discussion for 30-40 minutes or so, and then we'll open up for question and answer. So to discuss the issue of Australia's sanctions on Russia, it's a pleasure to be joined by Stefan Romanov and Peter Kuzmin. Stefan is first Vice President of the Ukrainian World Congress and co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations. Peter is President of Svoboda Alliance Victoria, a grassroots pro-democracy movement that sprang up organically in Australia and New Zealand in the wake of the protests that swept Russia in 2021 when Alexei Navalny returned from overseas and was arrested. Peter's spoken here before on that. Finally, just before we start, I'd like to pay tribute to an absent friend, Les Rowe, known to many and who sadly died last week. Les was a former ambassador to the Russian Federation and president of this institute for a couple of years. He certainly would have been here tonight and offered his insights. So just to set the scene, following Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine, which clearly is a gross violation of international law and a contravention of the United Nations Charter, as you know, Australia has joined other Western nations to impose sanctions on Russia that focus on persons, financial actors, and technological capabilities aimed at the regime, although obviously there will be spin-off effects on ordinary Russians. So to start the ball rolling, I might just put it to Stefan and Peter, what is the overall goal of the sanctions?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and greetings from the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations and the Ukrainian World Congress. The Congress represents 20 million Ukrainians in about 65 countries. I think we need to go back one step and ask why are we here? Obviously, in your introduction, you've mentioned that Putin has crossed the barrier in terms of international law. Every convention has been broken, and the world needed to react. The question of sanctions and why sanctions is, hindsight's a beautiful thing. 2 years ago, we said from the Ukrainian World Congress point of view, implement SWIFT, implement Magnitsky, hit the oligarchs, hit the people around him, we probably wouldn't be here today. Why I say that is because I think the people around him are the people who need to defend the most, and it isn't human life. It's the thing that they adore, and that is dollars, wealth, and so on. So the sanctions, all the sanctions that we've now done is, obviously we've listed the ante. The sanctions have been, from Australia's point of view, I think Australia has joined the allies, and in the conversations with the Prime Minister and also other members of government, we've basically said, you need to join the allies and make sure that, and sometimes not even join the allies, sometimes lead. And we saw what happened after MH17. Australia took the lead. So these sanctions, I think they're slowly starting to work, but the question is it too late? We've had thousands of people that have died. Thousands will continue to die. And whether the sanctions will stop, and I think we'll get into the next part of this as to what else can be done. But sanctions are important to send a message. And I think the message is that we've now collectively, internationally, ostracized Russia. Russia is now ostracized. Russia has Eritrea supporting it. Why? Dollars. Syria, dollars. North Korea. So if you're going to go into battle, you really haven't got many people to go into battle with. The only problem now is that people still continue to die. So sanctions are important, and I think later on in tonight's discussion, we'll talk a little bit about those sanctions, and we'll talk about what sort of sanctions still are open to us to continue to put on pressure.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's the first time for me to participate in an event like this. I feel like I'm representing the voice of ordinary Russians. I've never been part of any political organization. I never even organized communities before. So until last year, when just kind of organically we had some protests and we just started gathering, what I saw that there are lots of ordinary Russians here who have the same analysis of what's happening in Russia. They value Russia a lot. They value the relationships. They have people there, but they're against the regime. They believe that that Putin's regime is taking the country into a towards a catastrophe of some sort. We just had this foreboding that something awful is going to happen. So looking at sanctions, the question of sanctions. So we had a feeling that we knew that Putin was massing the army around the borders of Ukraine. I honestly believe that was just a big bluff, that he just wanted to extract some concessions from the West. He is motivated by personal power, by greed. And I thought that, okay, he doesn't like the sanctions that Russia has been under since 2014, and he wants to really force the West to relax the sanctions and then allow him to be a recognized and valuable player. What we thought, we as our organization, we wanted to participate in political lobbying, and we did think that imposing sanctions proactively on the Russian regime was an appropriate step that Australia should take. When Alexei Navalny came back to Russia following his poisoning by the Kremlin, before he came back, he published a list of 35 individuals on whom Putin's regime relied. And he said, these are the people who are enabling the regime to go on and be very effective. It included state officials, it included propagandists, and it included the oligarchs. So like all the key elements of his power, of his regime. So what we wanted to do is lobby the Australian government to be the leaders in imposing sanctions on the people who have the most power. Basically the elite, the 35 that really control, have lots of impact on how things are happening. I was very much against broad-based sanctions. I know that just broad-based sanctions, economic sanctions, they hurt ordinary people. After 2014, the sanctions that were imposed on Russia, they hurt ordinary Russians. And I knew that in an autocracy, the people are made to suffer for the dictator. The dictator makes everyone suffer, not only people abroad. He makes people inside suffer a lot. And he squashes the opposition. He tries to kill the leader of the opposition. And it just miraculously, he didn't kill Alexei Navalny. But I believe that before the war, I believe that really the purpose of the sanctions is to put as much pressure as possible on the elites. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I mean, as Stefan said, the sanctions were imposed post factum. It took an invasion really to galvanise everyone into action. From the Australian side, there's been talk of super funds divesting. There was a report today that Australia has imposed new sanctions on military officers and propagandists, as a result of which Russia has now placed Australia on a list of so-called unfriendly countries. So perhaps it's biting, but maybe Stefan, I can ask you just to talk about what other sanctions has Australia imposed so far?
Thank you. Just to Peter's comment about sanctions and who they should hit, we totally agree. That's why a couple of years ago, what we said was hit them. Yeah. Don't hit the country, hit them, because they're the people who ultimately are dictating the terms. And I often have used this example. Could you imagine being a multi-millionaire, billionaire, with a beautiful $60 million house in Chelsea, with a, $100 million yacht. And all of a sudden you come home and there's a chain and a lock on the door. You put your card in the ATM and it says declined. You go and run to your, as Abramovich is doing, to your yacht, and it's repossessed. That's where the action needs to be. I've just finished a book about what the West doesn't know about Putin, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. In that book, they articulate that ultimately there are those people who are controlling Putin. People think Putin is controlling. Putin may be controlling some, but there are a lot of people who are controlling Putin. And why? Because they have a vested interest. In terms of sanctions, what Australia has done, I met with the Prime Minister last week. He called the week before. We spoke about these things. And I think Australia's position has been a very measured but strong position. Basically, what the Prime Minister said and other ministers I've met with, we can't throw everything out at once. So, we were calling out for lethal military aid. And first of all, it was non-military. It was humanitarian aid. And then it was lethal. And so there's $100 million that has been allocated. And the first lot of humanitarian has hit Europe. And the lethal will be javelins and whatever they decide and have an arrangement with people overseas. So the sanctions of now adding others, and again, this is where we've been advocating for the Magnitsky. We've been saying, target them, go to the Gold Coast, and find out exactly who owns what, because that's today, for example, negotiations, and I agree with Peter. Tomorrow, Kuleba and Lavrov are meeting. So what are they going to say? You do this. Well, Ukraine has already said we're not giving up. Lavrov will say you'll have to give us this, or we're not going to give us this. So all of a sudden, we're going to have missiles flying. It's going to continue. So at this point in time, the sanctions that Australia is imposing, they are what Australia can do, and I applaud both political parties in Australia. We have discussed this with the Prime Minister. We've had discussions with the Leader of the Opposition. And the one thing that distinguishes us from, I think, the Americans and others, we have a bipartisan approach. So, for example, this afternoon, I spoke with Senator Katrina Bilek, who is the co-chair of the Australian Federation, the Australian Ukrainian Parliamentary Group, and with Senator David Van. Next week, there'll be a motion. There'll be a motion that both parties put up in terms of strengthening our position. So that for Australia is very, very important. And in terms of ongoing sanctions, as the government has said, they will continue. We have sanctions now in terms of, people laughed when we took on some of the outlets on vodka. They said, so what's vodka got to do with it? We've targeted particular investment companies. We've targeted people who basically have gone and said to their investors, you know what, rock bottom, let's make a buck. And then when people say, well, why are you targeting? Because it's not about dollars. The reason we're here where we are is because we have a set of values, and our values are aligned with the international community. We want democracy. We want exactly what you're talking about. What do you want in Russia? I honestly believe that in Russia, people don't want anything more than the people in Ukraine. My family in Ukraine, what does it want? Wants their children to be able to travel, have education, have a normal life, because they have seen in the last 30 years how the normal person lives. So the bourgeois nationalists that they're trying to portray in being, the West is, nothing but bad, it's been broken. That mold's been broken. So I think with the sanctions, we need to continue with those sanctions. They will be, and I believe from the Australian government point of view, it's not finished. It will be staged. And I think the more Putin decides not to play ball, unfortunately, it's the people in Russia who are going to suffer. Stock market down, ruble worth nothing, MasterCard gone, Visa gone, can't travel, and somebody's asked me, well, how did in 2013, how did you go about the revolution of dignity? It takes a spark, and let's hope that Putin is the spark.
Stefan. Just to follow on from there, I do want to acknowledge the very bipartisan approach that Australian government has taken. I think it's really valuable. I lived in the States for 7 years, and I can see the country really being ripped apart, and I'm following it. It's a country ripped apart by partisan tensions. I think Australia is much more harmonious in this way, and I think this is the opportunity to show that Australia can lead on the global stage in the way it implements sanctions. So the other point I appreciated was about the measured, staged approach to sanctions. I think it's really important to do that. You implement one set of sanctions and you wait for the results, because what the purpose of sanctions is to entice some action, right? So the sanctions have to affect the elites. They also put pressure on the ordinary people, who in turn put pressure on the elites. And the point of sanctions fundamentally is to force the elites, so force Putin and all the people around him to make a collective decision. Okay, this is it, we need to stop. The cost of this war is way too high. Then specifically on the types of sanctions, I think it's, I fully support peaceful humanitarian aid that Ukraine is receiving. I do think that Australia has to be a bit more measured and careful with military aid, lethal aid. I know that people are fighting, and it's a very uneven fight. Russia has accumulated so many weapons, and it's throwing its full might at Ukraine, and it's really tough, and Ukraine needs support. But I think this needs to be measured, because ultimately people are dying right now. From the early days, at least, of the war, when I was following closely, there were 3 times as many Russian soldiers that were dying than the Ukrainian soldiers, and civilians as well. So Russia right now is really paying a lot in human life, not just in all the other economic sanctions, etc. So finally, I want to say, I think it's really important to, with non-lethal sanctions and aid, to think about who we want to impact. So I think it's really important to go after the elites, but then I really hope that Australia goes a bit more gently on the ordinary people, because in Russia, there are so many people that are hurting. I've been communicating with my family, with my friends, and I have relatives in Ukraine, and I know that millions of Ukrainians live in Russia as well. So all these sanctions that impact ordinary people, they impact Ukrainians as well who live in Russia, and they impact people who have no way of really force the elites without risking too much. You've probably seen that people come out and protest in the streets, but then they're brutally being beaten up and detained. And the cost of these protests that I was myself advocating for, I was saying, yeah, Russians should rise up and go into the streets. But I see, after talking to lots of people, just the cost is just too high. The risk is too high. People have their children and their older relatives. They feel responsible. They feel like, okay, if it's just me, I can go out in the street and protest and do. But they feel responsible for their families. And I think Australia has to be really mindful of the impact on the ordinary people.
Thanks, Peter. Well, maybe I can sort of jump ahead to a question that was going to come up, which was exactly that. What is the human cost? There was an article in The Age yesterday, headlined "Ukrainians shocked to find relatives in Russia don't believe there's a war." I don't know if you have a feeling how many Russians have relatives in Ukraine, or vice versa, but obviously there is an impact on the ordinary people, as Stefan said. The group has fallen, interest rates have gone up. That's played straight through into mortgages. The economy's suffering. But how do we keep the pressure up without penalising those who are not to blame?
Unfortunately, I don't think there's a way of doing that. We have to be realistic. How do you stop an 18-month-old baby getting killed? How do you stop people trying to get through a green zone being shot? How do you stop missiles going into kindergartens? How do you stop missiles going into educational institutions? How do you stop missiles going into historic buildings? Unfortunately, there's going to be a cost, and there is a cost. And I've said, you know, you mentioned Russian soldiers dying. The Ukrainians dying as well. But, you know, when the Ukrainians die, we have a saying, heroes never die. That they will continue to be heroes. So Zelensky says to the Red Cross, come and pick up 3,000 bodies because nobody's looking after them. So what sort of respect does Putin have to his own people? And, you know, I think I keep talking about that spark. I think the reason why these sanctions, and I tend to agree and disagree in terms of how severe sanctions are and who they impact, because unless there is that spark, unless people on the ground feel this, there's not going to be a change. And ultimately, if you talk about Ukrainian soldiers dying and Russian soldiers dying, I'm sure when those bodies go back, mothers and fathers are going to say, what the hell is this all about? Why is my 18-year-old son or 20-year-old daughter who thought was going on a maneuver, is stuck in the middle of a war, is killed and is lying here dead? So the sanctions need to, you know, I know that they're going to hit people, but if they don't hit people hard, we're going to continue because Putin doesn't understand. If he had any respect at all, there's no respect for and those around him. And when we've now started the campaign of international courts, and we have here in Australia, we have a set of QCs headed up by William Lai, who's a QC, working with people overseas about the war crimes, about Russia being labelled as terrorists, about Putin being a war criminal. Why? Because ultimately people see that they have to use what they can to try and get a result. So are the sanctions going to do everything? They're not. We need to continue to hit, in the first instance, we need to hit those around him and hit them hard and not stop. And that's why, you know, sometimes when I think, you know, maybe I'm naive, you know, maybe emotion takes over from time to time. But I just don't, I don't understand our decision makers. I don't understand America. I don't understand NATO. I don't understand their stance. You're talking about somebody who's broken every law, international law in the book. Right? And the other day, we get a call from Ukraine saying, can you find some lawyers who can argue a case why we should have a no-fly zone? We need a reason to do it legally. And I know that there is the issue of could be a third world war. You know, that's what everybody's talking about. Or Putin getting up one day in a bad mood and pressing the button of the nuclear reactor. But, you know, what are we going to do? Are we going to, for the next, because this is not going to finish in a week. And for example, I know that Blinken was in a meeting with our people in Kyiv, and we're going to call on Sunday. You know, you're in for the long haul. Well, obviously we're in for the long haul, but we don't want to be in for the long haul. I mean, if Ukraine was able to fight on the ground, just on the ground, I think they'd match it. It's missiles flying, it's nuclear, it's all those other things. So when you talk about hitting people and you talk about hitting the Russian people, I think I can just talk about what happened in Ukraine in 2013 and how the revolution, I was there from day one, how the revolution of dignity started. It wasn't Yanukovych, you know, he decided he wasn't going to Europe. So people got excited. And I had Marie Fakara from New South Wales with us because we were there to commemorate the Holodomor. And all of a sudden, you know, there's a bit of an uprising. And people are saying, you know, oh, we want to go to Europe, we want to go to Europe. But that was okay for 3 or 4 days. But it was winter and it was going to be Christmas. I tell you what the turning point was on the eve of the 29th, when we had an arrangement with the government to move stages, and when the military came in and belted the living daylights out of some students, that was the spark. And next morning we got to the St. Michael's Square and we started to chant, Kyiv Stay. In other words, Kyiv arise. And from there on, the whole thing changed. So in Russia at the moment, what you need is a spark. And I suppose we shouldn't be talking about inciting revolution in Russia, because that's not what we should be doing. But you know what? I don't see any other way. I don't. What are the two components? Get the people around him, get the population. What's he left with? You go in your bunker and sit there until there is now a bounty out for him before somebody shoots you. So that is in my opinion, that's what's going to happen. Because once all that money goes and everything goes, he's got nothing left. And I agree with you. He's now embarrassed Russia. Russia has no friends. So why is the guy in St. Petersburg? Why is he the end result of all this? Why Melbourne has said we're breaking off sister city relations? The people are getting hit, but the people also need to take action. It's like here, you don't like the government. What do? You vote them out. I'm not sure that happens over there.
So first of all, I want to say that I have so much respect for the revolution of dignity. Like, to me, this is one of the most incredible things that happened in recent history. The fact that just ordinary people, they just came out into the streets and they stood for values, and they forced change. They seemed outnumbered, it seemed impossible. And actually, a week ago, one of the Ukrainians from Sydney called me and said, Peter, I see that you are doing a lot, you're organizing. You really have to follow the same strategy. Yes, you're far away, but just think about it as an ocean. We are like, you start a wave here, it can eventually hit Russia. So what we're doing here is we have a daily vigil against the war on Princess Bridge in the center of the city. And we're hoping that it's a really small thing, but something will come out of it. And we'll see how it goes. But anyway, just on the topic of sanctions, several points. One is timeline. So we acknowledge that different sanctions work on different timelines, right? So some sanctions are very immediate. You cut off credit cards, people are hit immediately, they feel the effect immediately. You call somebody a war criminal. First, it takes time to implement this, and then that moral pressure that you are building up on the people, it takes time to work its way. So I think Australian politicians designing the sanctions, this roadmap for the sanctions against Russia, they really need to be mindful of the different timelines that different types of sanctions work on. And they really have to be very intentional about what are they trying to achieve with each specific measure, right? We know that ultimately the people who can stop the war, these are the elites. And you need to design the sanctions in such a way, in a very systematic way, that all the different pressures, direct pressure on the elites, as well as the pressure from the bottom up, it coincides in a point that Russia on its own, that Putin says, offers peace himself, right? So I do believe it's possible, and I think we can somehow work it out.
Thank you. Sanctions aside, yesterday the Prime Minister in his address to the Lowy Institute was talking about an arc of autocracy, and the sanctions clearly, obviously, are aimed at the Russian regime. It has to be an international effort. It's the Western liberal democracies pushing it. But coming on the flip side, to help Ukraine, the Prime Minister talked a bit, I think, about temporary safe haven visas. But is there anything more that Australia could be doing in the way of assistance to Ukraine versus sanctions?
Look, we've been involved from day one on this whole issue of visas and so on. The Australian government has taken a position with the support of the opposition that what's the objective? The objective is to get people out of the danger zone. So how do you do that? The easiest way was to do tourist visas. There have been about over 2,000 tourist visas approved. and they continue to approve. And any hiccup we have, it's one call to Minister Hawke's office, and somehow these issues are resolved. Australia has said when they get here, and we're now in discussion because we've said, okay, they get here as a tourist visa, it gives them the here, that they're going to be looked after by somebody. So we're now talking about, a special humanitarian program, which involves all those benefits that people have. The community has rallied. The Ukrainian community itself has rallied. It's unbelievable why it takes, sometimes it was like the revolution, why it takes a crisis to bring everybody together. At the same time, the broader Australian community, I mean, look, I've said this time and time again, the Australian community has been absolutely fantastic. You get people on the street. I've had people, I worked with 30 years ago saying, listen, we're with you. Offers of support. What can we do? And we've put on our website, we've had to put on our website, if you want to volunteer, tell us what you want to do, because we get so many people. We have companies who have ultimately said, you know what, we're going to donate. I'll go back to vodka. I don't want to make a big deal on vodka, but we all like vodka. And
I don't.
Senator, he likes vodka. He's an old friend of the Ukrainian community. He knows it. But ultimately, we've had companies who said, you know what, we're going to give you a $50,000 donation, plus we're going to give you $15 for every bottle of vodka we sell. And our executives said, oh, should we be doing it? It's a show of support. And is Australia doing enough in that area? Australia is, I think, at this point in time, and I'm in contact with Minister Hawke every day, and his department and the PM's department. Any issue that we have, there are, governments like, there are no roadblocks. So the government is also, from my understanding, wants to support the community financially in some shape or form. What else can it do? I think it continues to that strategy of responding to the situation. So next situation, we get another lot of sanctions, we get another lot of sanctions. But I think also what it has done, the government has done, and so is the media, and I'll come back to the media at the moment. What they've done is basically put Ukraine and Australia on the map, because you used to go somewhere, Ukraine, you must be Russian. The Ukraine, Kiev, we took on Channel 7 now, KYIV. The Herald Sun, KYIV. They're little things, but people say to me, well, what about, so what? Well, my response to that is I talk to people in Ukraine on a regular basis. And when they saw Melbourne lit up blue and yellow, and that was one phone call to the Premier's office to say, listen, do us a favour. I was in Sydney the other day, the Opera House, Adelaide, Story Bridge, Tasmania. Those little things for people in Ukraine, and I was on Odessa TV last night, or during the night tonight. When I said to them, how motivating, how that just gives us strength, that just gives us the opportunity to go ahead because we've got the world behind us. So it's those little sanctions sometimes that play a big role. And from the point of view where Australia goes to now, look, I think they're going to continue to respond to what Putin does or doesn't do. They're going to stick with the international community. But we've also suggested to government, you know what, you can go for the ride with the international community or you can lead it. And I think there are particular things that Australia can do to lead this thing. And one of the things is the strengthening of Magnitsky, because I think that's the legislation is there. That's one thing that we can certainly lead on. Australian government obviously got behind SWIFT. There are other, in terms of these people who have been put on the bad list. We've said, for example, the ambassador of Russia should be expelled, and government has explained its position, and we understand some of that, because obviously there are Australians in Russia, therefore quid pro quo, you go. So there's got to be protection for that. But there's another thing that we've discussed with government, for example, and it doesn't really relate too much to us, but we've been trying to influence other governments about this. You would have seen the 18-month-old child that got killed. Children are dying, students are dying. Yet somewhere in this world, there are children of oligarchs sitting in luxury apartments studying. So we've suggested, especially to our counterparts in England, where I think a lot of them are, and the US, you need to find these. And these guys need to be told in 24 hours, pack up, go to mum and dad, sit in Russia. When this is all finished, you can come back. But it's highly unfair that people die and others are living the life of luxury. So there are little things that you can do now. It's a matter of tweaking now. I think you've got to tweak. I mean, a lot of the sanctions, you know, they're pretty strong sanctions. Australia has, you know, military, you know, all those sorts of things. But at the same time, there are these little tweaks which I think can hit exactly the people you're talking about.
Yeah. I just want to say that I met Stefan for the first time only a month ago, and I felt like an immediate connection. And what we talked about was values, our shared values. There's so much history between Russia and Ukraine, and if you start talking about history, there's all the grievances on both sides, and that's no way to connect. What we can connect on is the values. So I think values are incredibly important when we think about sanctions as well, right? So when Australia opposes the Kremlin regime, Putin, so it fundamentally, it's a battle of values. Australia stands for the rule of law, for democracy, and I think when politicians design sanctions against Russia, they have to think about that. So should Australia ban some laws to make it more difficult? I don't think so. I don't think it's the right approach. Should Australia expel ambassadors? I don't think it helps. What we want to force the state, the Russian state, rather than the Russian people, is to come to the table in good faith and negotiate, right? So when we think about, and I think Australia already has laws that are very useful to impact the situation. The Magnitsky amendments that were implemented only in December last year. This is a perfect instrument for Australia to impose really harsh sanctions on the elites, very direct, immediate sanctions. And I completely agree. The families of those oligarchs, they have to be included as well. They have to be sent back to Russia. They're not being arrested or anything. They just shouldn't enjoy the luxuries of the Western world, of a civilized world, when they are supporting a corrupt regime. So I think one easy, very simple set of sanctions that the Australian government can do is impose personalized sanctions on not just those 5 additional propagandists, etc., but every single member of the United Russia Party, right? So the way Putin has his power, it's not just the money, the oligarchs, etc. So first of all, there are those 35 that Navalny has identified, but also there's this whole apparatus within the state. It's the United Russia Party. There are people who are genuine, who are really working hard for the Russian people in the government. And I don't think it would be fair on them to be sanctioned. I think it's really important for the West to show that the West is not against the ordinary Russian people, it's against the machine, the regime. So the sanctions should be targeting the regime. So there is a list. We know the people who voted for this war, essentially, who gave Putin the power to this military power, put them on the personalized sanction list. All the members of the United Russia Party, they are complicit in all of this. They've been enjoying the benefits of this vertical of power that Putin has been building. So I believe that the most effective way of really forcing Putin to the table and the elites around him to put pressure on him to come to the table is to impose the harsh sanctions according to the laws that are already in place, right? So Australia doesn't need to bend any laws. It just has to use its own laws effectively in a targeted way.
Well, I'll move to one final question, then we'll go to audience Q&A, so try and keep it brief. Sanctions obviously are somewhat of a blunt instrument. Do you see any chance of balancing sanctions with some sort of incentives for Russia to stop the war or broker peace or reparations, whatever it might be?
Simple question, no. I'll tell you why. You're talking about the Russian people, that's one thing. They have no say in this. You're talking about a madman who's totally out of control, and to give him any enticement that, we'll give you this and you'll be a good boy. This guy doesn't work this way. Therefore, there is no easy way out of this. And I know we try to be, put the emotion aside, and we try to be logical about how things could turn out. You're not dealing with a person who is logical. You're dealing with a person who's totally out of control. A person who takes a nuclear reactor, wants to blow it up, and then says, you know what, let us say to West End, you want to start something? Well, I'll show you. He doesn't care that at the end of the day, it's not going to affect Ukraine, it's going to affect the whole of Europe. So I don't see incentives for him. I see incentives for some of those people who ultimately can have some influence, and that's not his oligarch people, but others who in the Russian Federation who might be able to say, you know what, we're going to take him on. But incentives are, with Putin are just not on. And I think, Peter, one of the points you make in terms of, hitting those that are close, I think we all agree with that. Unfortunately, that in this situation, it's very, very hard to say we're not going to hit the Russian Federation, because I think the West is basically saying, if we can get the Russian Federation or the Russian people mad enough, there will be some spark. Unfortunately, like in Ukraine, people are dying. Like in Russia, we're going to have a situation where people are saying, why is this happening? Why is this happening? And today, the question of incentives, I just don't see it working. It's not a thing that in a state of war, for example, I'll tell you where push is going to come to shove, not in terms of incentives, is when Ukraine and Russia sit at the table and say, well, what are you going to give up to stop this? And I think maybe a little while ago, given some of the people around the president of Ukraine, there might have been a bit of a, we'll give and take, but I think people learned very quickly that in diplomacy, if you and I want to have a conversation, it's a win-win situation. You win a bit, I win a bit. In Putin's situation, he wins, you lose. There's no win-win, and therefore to try and give him an incentive is not going to work. But I think what we really need to try and do is get that spark going, and ultimately there are different triggers that can happen that can maybe change this, because in the conversation, and I can't speak on behalf of the Ukrainian government, but my sense is that there is going to be very little compromise. You have now taken us on. Well, we're going to fight you to the, I mean, originally, what was the Minsk thing about? Why didn't the Minsk thing work? The Luhansk and Donetsk, you give that away and then everything will be fine. And then, the argument of the propaganda and your question before about other sanctions, the fact that Australia now has taken very, very seriously the question of Russian propaganda. We've now argued, get Russia today off SBS, we've got it off Foxtel. That propaganda machine continues to go, and people in Russia don't believe there's a war anyway. And again, you could take it on face value, but when you have a prisoner, a Russian prisoner, with a Ukrainian who says, here's a phone, talk to your mum, and mum says, I sent you out to get a bottle of milk, where are you? I mean, that's the reality of what we're hearing. Young people who have been sent out, just to be fodder, ultimately just to be fodder. And if he thinks that he cares about people, he doesn't care about his people. He only cares about one thing, and it's Vladimir Putin.
So my simple answer to the question of should you balance sanctions with incentives is yes. So, and here's the reason why. I think I hear a lot of what you're saying, and it makes sense. But the problem is you're making this equation between Putin and Russia. And at the same time, you want Russians to rise up and do something to force Putin to the negotiation table. So when the West is thinking about the response, how to handle Russia as a whole, not just Putin, not just the elites, but Russia as a whole. I think it's important to have the ordinary people also in mind, not just the elites, right? Don't give anything to Putin. Don't give anything to elites. Put all the pressure on them. But I think it's really important. So, and there are a couple of very obvious things. So you have the fact that there are lots of Russians who still don't see the real war. They don't, because of the propaganda machine is so strong, they don't see the impact of the real war. They don't have the facts, so they don't understand. So it's really hard. So the measures against propaganda, absolutely spot on. 10 months ago, we sent an open letter to SBS. SBS has been rebroadcasting anti-war news, which has been spewing propaganda for a long time. We couldn't get an answer from SBS for a long time. Only when the war started, they finally said, okay, we'll shut it down. So and the same, and then Foxtel, etc. followed. So propaganda, hit propaganda with everything you've got. Across the world, make it really hard for them to operate. Make it more difficult for propaganda to operate. But then, for the ordinary people, I think, so President Zelensky has addressed the Russian people several times in his addresses, and he speaks very passionately, and well, the problem is lots of Russians, they don't take him seriously, right? They think, oh, he doesn't make any decisions, it's the Americans, it's the NATO, it's the big powers that control the situation. So I think the important thing, and this is what I read in an article by Leonid Bershitsky a couple of months ago, the argument he's making is that the West collectively has to make that separation right now between the regime and the people and handle them separately. The West should be really hard with the elites, with Putin, but at the same time, Biden and other leaders, Australian Prime Minister, can make an address to the Russian people and say, we understand the plight of the Russian people. We understand that you don't live in a democracy. You cannot affect the situation. We understand that if you go out into the streets to protest, you will be beaten up, and etc. So I think it's really important for the West to show its support for the ordinary people and not impose sanctions that will just cripple everyone. Not the important thing to understand, like, so if a pharmaceutical company is not sending medicine to Russia, there are people who don't have any other medicine. They die. Like you talk about that, and it's very true. Like it's heartbreaking to see babies in Ukraine, in Ukrainian cities dying, but then the invisible story, part of the story, is that because of these sanctions that are currently being imposed, these broad-based economic sanctions, ordinary people in Russia are suffering and dying, those who have no control over the situation, so babies are dying, etc. So I think it's really important to balance these two considerations and really separate, finally, once and for all, separate Putin and his regime from the ordinary people. These are two different things. This is what we've been saying very loudly with our protests, and I really hope that people who are here and who watch this, they will. This is one important message that I believe they should take away from this. Russian people is not Putin, is not Putin's regime, and the West, if it wants to stop the war, it really needs to think about these two actors in the situation, impose sanctions on the regime, and promise some incentives for the ordinary Russians. Don't hit them. Just don't just revoke all the visas. I know that some have said, "Oh, just kick out all the Russians from Australia, send them back on the ones on temporary visas, send them back to Russia, make them fight there." So my mother just arrived 2 weeks ago. I don't want her to be sent back to Russia with her. She's on tourist visa. She's kicked over there. Like, it just doesn't seem fair. So I think everybody knows instinctively what's fair, right? And I think politicians have to always keep this in mind, keep the ordinary person in mind. And I think it's really useful to have this sort of discussion. I'm really thankful for AIIA for allowing me, like, I don't have any qualifications really to be an expert here, but I'm the representative. Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. All right.
It's just like Russia, isn't it?
Sorry, yeah, didn't mean to shut you down.
All good.
Trying to get a couple of questions in before we run out of time. If there are any here, just stick your hand up to get the right mic. But first off, from the Zoom audience, to bring China into it, what's your view that further sanctions on Russia might just reinforce Russian ties with China, and China then becomes the sanction customer?
We some weeks ago, before this started, said that once we get into one foot into Ukraine, is a green light for China. Taiwan, I mean, people who've joined us in rallies from China, from Hong Kong, Singapore, other places. So I think the China question is a very, very important one. You see, I mean, you know, has China sanctioned Russia? Has China said stop? Has it? Hasn't it? It hasn't. It is basically, it's been taken the position of, well, maybe we will, maybe we won't. So I think for Australian politics, we talk about Australia, obviously the geopolitics in terms of Australia, very important to understand that the China relationship here is very, very important, and we need to be very, very careful, because we could have a different world in 10 years' time, and actually it might not be 10 years' time. 12 months ago, who would have thought Ukraine was going to be in the situation it is? So I think the China question is a very, very important one.
Yeah, and I would just agree. I do think that China is watching, and if the West allows Putin to take over Ukraine, it will be just a recipe for a disaster, a global disaster, because it will empower all the bad actors on the international stage to do the same. And Taiwan will be next, for sure.
Yes, thank you to the panelists. I have a question that goes beyond sanctions and looks towards more transnational corporations. We've seen mostly Western companies like Shell, BP, and especially communications companies like Facebook and TikTok decide to cease their operations in Russia. I suppose this connects specifically to the idea around propaganda. What greater role can these corporations have in placing pressure on Putin, on the regime, through the Russian people, without giving too much damage to the ordinary people? Thank you.
Well, I can't speak for Shell, but Facebook, I'll tell you what Facebook could do, start to become responsible. That's what it can do. Because part of the problem is, up until now, it's allowed lots of things to get through. And I think now, okay, so, you know, we've stopped this, we've stopped that. But they've all got a role to play. But I think, to go to your point, Peter, yes, look, you want the normal guy in the street in Russia to understand that the world is with you. But it's like China. How do you get the message out that the world is with you when you can't have this, can't have that, everything's banned? You know, half the people in Russia don't even know there's a war. And the ones that do know, well, they're doing a little bit of activity here. There's no big deal here. And that's why I mentioned before about those Russian soldiers. Once those Russian soldiers start to get, you know, the deceased go back to Russia, and people start to see, you know, what is it, 11,000, 12,000? You know, 11,000 soldiers. You know, that's a lot of people. And bring them back and say, these people have died for what? So we all have a role to play, but I think that the question of how you, and you're probably better placed than I are in terms of working out how the messages get through with these companies into Russia. But, you know, there is a block. It is a block, and it's called government. And you know what? We're champions of propaganda, throwing it out, but we don't let anything in. And I think, and you're probably better knows how that part of the world, how part of that part of the world operates.
I think I'll address this question of propaganda and transnational corporations in a bit more depth. So absolutely, you have to deal with propaganda and you have to send truthful messages to people in Russia. We agree that the fundamental issue is that in Russia, people don't understand fully what's going on. They don't have the facts. So should Russian TV stations and newspapers, etc., operate here while the war is going on? Absolutely not. I think all of them should be shut down until the war is over. They shouldn't be broadcasting their messages. It's like allowing Hitler to publish, Nazi Germany to publish newspapers in England and Paris. It just makes no sense. However, what we can balance, social media is actually the solution. It's the solution. I think it's really unproductive for the Western corporations to shut down access to the information that ordinary Russians like ourselves. So people in Russia, they stop believing, they're suspicious of what they see from TV because they've been lied to for a long time. So what they trust is personal messages from each other, from the network of people they trust, they respect and know, etc. They know personally. Russia has a very low rate of vaccination, despite Sputnik vaccine was developed so early on and it's effective by all accounts. Why is that? It's because the Russian people, they don't trust what they see on TV. So the state is telling them, oh, you should get vaccinated. And people don't get vaccinated because they don't believe the authorities. So I think it's very counterproductive to cut off, for social media, to cut off access to Russia. Because like, allow us Russians living abroad a channel to speak to people in Russia. If you simply put an iron gate, like a fence around Russia, and you don't allow any flow of information, what are we going to have? We're going to have a concentration camp the size of 1/6 of the planet. I mean, it's just not going to work. We'll end up cornering not only Putin, but all of Russia. Right now, it's Putin's war, but it will become Russian people's war. Does the West really want it? I don't think so. And I think it's really important to, you talked about spark. So we are trying to create this spark, but how do we publicize this? If we don't have access to our people, our friends and relatives back at home, we want to show them that we are standing with you. We're standing with Ukraine, but we're standing with you. We want you to inspire. We want to inspire you to believe that the West is not against you, ordinary people. The West is with you. The response we're getting here at our vigil is ordinary Australians are coming up to us, and it's just very genuine. And I think it's really important to show to the people of Russia that the West is not against them; it's against the regime. And that way, the people of Russia and the West will unite together against the common enemy, which is Putin and his corrupt regime.
Yeah, I'll give you one suggestion what Ukraine has done. We've had different TV stations, and what they've done in the case of war, there's only one TV station now, which is an amalgamated station of all stations, and they go through 24 hours a day. So a bit different in Russia, but if you had a group, a consortium of TV stations who had the guts to come out and do that. I know that with Ukraine, people, I was with Odessa last night saying, I don't know whether we're going to be here tomorrow because this thing might blow up. But they have now, even those stations that didn't get on, and one was pro this and one was anti that, 24/7, they're just rolling this thing out.
Okay, well, thank you. That brings us to the end of our time. And apologies to the Zoom audience, we couldn't get through all the questions, but we covered a lot of ground. Thank you to Stefan and Peter for coming. I think the fact we can hold a panel like this is it's a powerful symbol that Ukrainians and Russians can work together, and people working together can hopefully find a way through the crisis. So thank you both very much for your time. Thank you to the Zoom audience for joining us.
Thank you very much.